I am not much of a bookworm. Reading? Kinda cringe. I don't typically read things, I'd rather watch things. But for Avatar, I make an exception. Throughout and after the series' original run, Avatar comics were continuously being made, but they were never really taken that seriously by the fandom until 2012, when they released The Promise. This release coincided with the release of The Legend of Korra, so it was likely Avatar hype that guaranteed the success of these post-series comics, which are still going to this day. Today, I'll be going through each of these comics and telling you why they kinda slap. I'm your host, MattCMG. Let's get weird, let's get wild, and let's get right into why you should read the Avatar comics. Avatar month is here, baby. Let's fucking go. But first, a little bit of background. The first set of Avatar comics to be released are known as the Lost Adventures. These were originally a bunch of short side stories taking place during the time of the show, and were originally released in Nickelodeon magazine during the show's original run. Later down the line in 2011, Dark Horse Comics would compile all of them into one big volume, which is now known as the Lost Adventures. First thing to note about these: the cover art. I fucking hate this. It's just this fucking face that Aang makes. This does not look like I'm the Avatar. This looks like, hey, I just stuck my erect cock into the cabbage guy's last good harvest. Like I mentioned, The Lost Adventures is an anthology, so it has lots of short little mini stories in it. Some of my favorites include Relics, The Bridge, Sword Bending, and Boomy vs. Toph Round 1. We never did get that Round 2, did we? I think the coolest thing about this little anthology series is that all of these stories, except for the chibi ones, are canon, and some of them actually answer some questions that the show didn't answer, or fills in some gaps that the show left out. For example, in The Bridge, we see how Team Avatar captured the Fire Nation ship that we see in The Awakening. Additionally, many of the shorter stories are only a few pages long, but some of them have really cool art styles, such as Fruit Stand Freestyle or Reach for the Toph. They aren't all that important in the grand scheme of things. In fact, many of them rely exclusively on humor, but they're still very fun to read. They're like little mini Tales of Ba Sing Se's, so go check them out, I'd recommend them. While The Lost Adventures was a fun little anthology that doesn't really affect all that much, The Promise is the first comic to have a plot and to explore the world and characters of this universe a lot deeper. From this point on, the main comic series takes place after the events of the show, and despite my reluctance to accept anything that continues Aang's story because the show's ending is just that good, I think that The Promise and the subsequent stories do a decent job at telling interesting stories with these characters, while also expanding the lore in many interesting ways. Now, one thing you should probably know about the majority of these post-series graphic novels is that a lot of them were made specifically to help bridge the gap between The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra. So if you don't like The Legend of Korra, these might be pretty hit or miss for you. But they aren't all that in your face about it, so take that as you will. Also, be warned that there will be minor spoilers throughout this video. I won't spoil anything major like plot twists or anything like that without warning you, because I do want to encourage everyone to read these on your own, but there will be small details throughout this video that may be considered spoilers, so you've been warned. You've been warned, so don't bitch about it in the comments to me. Fuck you. The Promise picks up where the show left off, and I mean right where it left off. It picks up right at the final scene of Aang and Katara kissing, where Sokka interrupts and some funny shenanigans occur. Aang and Katara are, as you could have easily guessed, officially a couple in these comics, and while it does come into play in this particular story, it doesn't matter all that much in some of the future ones. Still kinda wholesome though. It is nice to see. Team Avatar are all celebrating the end of the 100-Year War in Ba Sing Se, when Zuko, in his typical brooding, tells Aang to promise that if he ever became like his father, that he should be taken out. Aang reluctantly accepts the promise, hoping that he'll never have to fulfill it. Then we fast forward a full year. Much is still to be done in the Earth Kingdom in its recovery from the war. Aang and Zuko, along with the Earth King, take on the Harmony Restoration Movement, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a project designed to restore parts of the Earth Kingdom that were affected by the war. This project involves relocating all Fire Nation citizens living in the now former colonies back to the Fire Nation. However, some problems arise from this. After years and years of colonization, both sides eventually get used to it, regardless of if that's a good thing or not. In the time since the Fire Nation colonized some of these Earth Kingdom villages, people of both nations would eventually start to mingle, which would lead to Fire Nation citizens starting families with Earth Kingdom citizens, and vice versa, which, as you could guess, poses a bit of a problem when relocating these people. In order to complete their project, Aang and Zuko would need to split these families apart, but the two surprisingly disagree on this issue. Zuko thinks that it's right to do things one way, while Aang thinks the other way is right, and they end up having an ideological clash that may lead Aang to be forced to fulfill his promise. Alongside this, Sokka is helping Toph start up the very first Beifong Metalbending Academy, which I think is a pretty self-explanatory title. This B-plot serves more so as a comedic relief to the otherwise pretty serious A-plot, though it does eventually come into play near the end. Regardless, these sections of the comic were extremely popular, so much so that Toph's Metalbending Academy is actually getting its own solo comic, which I'll get to a little bit later.
So that was a fucking lie.
The first thing I want to note about not just The Promise, but also the next few trilogies is the art style. Illustrated by Gurihiru, this art style, I think, really captures the essence of Avatar. It's bright and detailed like the show itself is, but with a bit more of a cartoony vibe to it. I can't really explain why I like it, I just kinda do. Truthfully, I think it's probably my favorite art style in the entire Avatar series, and I would not mind if this art style were ever put to animation in any way. Getting back into the story though, I think the thing that I like the most about The Promise is that it shows us that just because Zuko is now the righteous Fire Lord and that Aang is the peace-loving Avatar, that they are still humans who can slip up and make mistakes. Zuko tries to specifically avoid becoming like Ozai, but unintentionally ends up doing it anyways. Aang tries to appease Roku by putting the world back to the way it was, and is so focused on that he ignores what his heart is telling him, with which Katara helps him see the light. It shows us that even though Aang and Zuko are now great friends, that they aren't going to see eye to eye all the time, and in doing so, they have to do what Roku and Sozin could not, and find a way to preserve their friendship in spite of their disagreement. This story actually heavily mirrors that of Roku and Sozin, and it's done that way by design. And speaking of Roku, this is actually the first time that Aang realizes that his past lives aren't always going to be helpful to him. Roku tells him to do one thing, and Aang disagrees so much that he attempts to sever his connection to Roku entirely, something that actually sticks around for the next few comic storylines. Aang ends up realizing that, much like him, the past avatars are flawed people as well, so they're gonna have flawed advice at times. He's not obligated to agree with or appease them just because he used to be them. As far as lore additions go, this comic has some major Korra setup. We see the beginnings of the Air Acolytes as a fan club for Aang, and the compromise that Aang and Zuko come to at the end of the comic ends up serving as the basis for what would eventually become Republic City. Overall, The Promise is a really strong first entry in this post-show comic series, and I think that mainly goes to how it was written just as any episode of the show would have been. It follows a similar narrative structure of character has problem, character makes mistake, character learns from mistake that the show is known for, and it just applies that to a different medium, all while adding to the lore in meaningful ways and telling a story that ultimately shows us that the war still has consequences even though it's over. The next big graphic novel arc to release is the one I'm sure most of you are familiar with, The Search. In case you don't know, this is the comic that everyone refers to as the one where they look for Zuko's mother, which obviously is something that a lot of fans have wanted to see, as it was the only major loose end that the series didn't answer. But this comic is much more than just an answer to a common fan question, as I think that this comic in particular really sticks the landing when it comes to emotional storytelling, even though I think the answer they provided is a little bit convoluted. And this is coming from a guy who unironically defends Rava and Vatu, so take that as you will. The Search picks up a bit after The Promise, where family is now very important to Zuko. In an effort to restore whatever family he has left, Zuko finds a clue that might lead him to his mother, so he decides to go on a journey to find her, and he brings Aang, Katara, and Sokka along, no Toph this time, but he also brings another person, Azula. As mentally unstable as she is, Ursa is her mother too, so Zuko believes that she also has a right to see her and to help find her. The relationship between Zuko and Azula is a major part of this comic, as Zuko desperately wants to help Azula and to be on good terms with her, kinda like how Katara and Sokka are, while Azula wants nothing to do with him. In fact, Azula's mental state hasn't exactly improved since we last saw her. She is still a fucking lunatic and is still hallucinating her mother and shit, which she believes to be real and begins to take it out on Team Avatar. A decent chunk of this story is told in flashbacks, many of which are scenes from Zuko alone that are either extended or told from a different person's perspective. These scenes fully explain what happened to Ursa, and I think most importantly shows us what her relationship with Ozai was like. In case you didn't think Ozai was a bad enough guy already, this comic shows us that he's even worse than the way the show presents him. Alongside his crimes of an attempted genocide, he can now add psychological spousal abuse to the list. Ozai is most certainly not a recipient of the not as much of a jerk as you could have been award. But, in order to fully explain what happened to Ursa, some spirit shenanigans are thrown in. We meet the Mother of Faces, a tree-like spirit that has powers relating to faces. She's actually the mother of Ko, the face stealer, which also comes into play a bit later. I actually can't talk about this any further without spoiling the twist for you, and I really don't want to do that, so skip to this timestamp if you don't want to be spoiled. We done? Okay, cool. I really don't like the Mother of Faces explanation for what happened to Ursa. After Ursa was banished, she met up with her old boyfriend, who now has a new face and a new name given to him by the Mother of Faces. He talks Ursa into also changing her face and name so they can finally be together, together and start a new family, but Ursa feels that, in order for her to truly be happy, she needs to leave her old life with Ozai behind her because it's just too painful for her. The Mother of Faces can do that, but in order to remove the memories of her old life, she'd also be getting rid of her memories of Zuko and Azula. And she goes through with it, which is what really annoys me. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that Ursa made the wrong decision here or anything, because obviously a lot of people who have faced abusive relationships like she did probably would make the same decision. It's not the wrong decision, it's just not the decision that Ursa would have made given everything that we know about her character. One thing that is made very clear in the show, and even in this comic, is that Ursa's #1 priority in life is her children. Based on that, I don't think Ursa would give up her memories of her children so easily. Was it really worth it for her to give up her memories of hate if her memories of love also go with it? I guess that's the question that this comic raises, and I guess it's effective in doing that, but it just felt out of character no matter what the in-comic explanation was, at least in my opinion. But overall, The Search has some very interesting ideas in it, and though the themes of family ties are very much in your face, it's not egregiously so. All the major characters stay in character, and there's even some fun little background gags and references. Like how when Iroh was filling in as Fire Lord for Zuko, he announces National Tea Appreciation Day, which is totally something that he would do. Another interesting tidbit that's kind of major is that the play that young Ursa wanted to try out for, Love Amongst the Dragons, was first mentioned by Zuko in the Ember Island Players.
Brought to you by the critically acclaimed Ember Island Players.
Ugh. My mother used to take us to see them. They butchered Love Amongst the Dragons every year.
This line seems to be some clever foreshadowing, that even when stuck with Ozai, Ursa still wanted to find a way to connect with her old life. The Search, while really good, isn't quite the best of the Avatar comics in my opinion, despite being the most popular, but it's still definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. The next comic in the series is The Rift. This one takes place an unspecified amount of time after The Search, where Avatar Yang Chen begins appearing to Aang, but he is unable to hear what she has to say. Aang eventually figures out that perhaps it has to do with Yang Chen's festival, an old air nomad tradition that he used to partake in. Aang brings Team Avatar and the Air Acolytes to the place where the festival was once held, but find that the lands once sacred to the air nomads have now been overtaken and polluted by industrialization. This is the Earth and Fire Refinery, a joint venture between Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom business moguls, one of which turns out to be Toph's father. Team Avatar needs to find a way to preserve these once sacred lands to fulfill a promise Yang Chen made to an ancient spirit, but Toph and the higher-ups at the refinery refuse in the name of technological progress. Without spoiling anything, things come to a head, and in more ways than one. Firstly, this comic deals heavily with the idea of tradition versus innovation. Aang wants to preserve his people's traditions, but innovation has made it difficult for him to do that. There was once an unspoken rule that though these were Earth Kingdom lands, they were still considered sacred to the air nomads, so nobody touched them. During the 100-Year War, there were obviously no more airbenders to keep up this tradition, so the tradition faded and this unspoken rule was no more. This causes Aang to wonder if his traditions were truly that important. Are traditions worth foregoing progress, but at the same time, is innovation worth destroying traditions? This is exacerbated by what Toph says, which leads into the second conflict of this comic, the juxtaposition of Toph and Aang. These two fight a lot in this comic. Toph has always been someone who tells it like it is, and she tells Aang to his face several times that nobody cares about his old traditions and that those traditions would be getting in the way of the future. It gets so bad, in fact, that Toph tries to go up against Aang in the Avatar state to stop him from destroying the factory. Now, if that ain't classic Toph, I don't know what is. Of course, the two still care for each other and their friendship is unharmed, but it's because of their friendship that their conflict didn't get too nasty, that they were able to hear each other out. I don't think that either of them would have come to the conclusions that they did if it weren't for the fact that they are such close friends. If I'm being perfectly honest though, The Rift is one of the least favorites of these comics for me. While it does raise some interesting questions and sets up a lot of stuff for the future comics, it's nothing that we haven't already seen in episodes like The Northern Air Temple or The Runaway. Avatar Yang Chen's backstory was cool, but I didn't feel that it added too much to the overall narrative of the comic aside from some necessary explainers. It felt like so much, yet also so little happened in this comic at the same time, and depending on who you are, that might be a good thing, but for me, I didn't really care for it. There are some minor things in this that I really liked, such as Aang's big-ass earthbending mecha that he does, or the origins of Cabbage Corp, and the characters and their dynamics all remain extremely consistent with who they were in the show, with the added context and character development of the previous comics. Much like the other comics, this one felt just like an episode of the show. This one just felt like more of a filler episode, if you know what I mean. It's not bad by any means, just one of the weakest of the bunch, in my opinion. Next in the series is Smoke and Shadow. While the comics up until now have mostly focused on the formation of what would later become the United Republic, this one focuses on the Fire Nation, more specifically how Zuko leads it in a time of crisis. This one picks up a few weeks after the search, yet still also after the rift, where Zuko is bringing his mother and her new family to the Fire Nation to officially move in. However, things in the Fire Nation aren't exactly perfect, as an underground group called the New Ozai Society has formed, who are still loyal to Ozai and want to bring Zuko down. This group is being led by Mei's father, Ukano, who is driven to do this by a group of mysterious spirits called the Kimurakage. After a failed attempt to dethrone Zuko, thwarted in large part to Mei and Ty Lee, a month passes, after which the Kimurakage begin to kidnap children throughout the Fire Nation. With spirits now involved, Zuko calls in Aang, and together with Mei, Ty Lee, and Suki, as well as a new character named Kalo, the group uncover the conspiracy of the New Ozai Society and discover the hidden origins of the Fire Nation and the Kimurakage. Alongside all of this, Ursa is having trouble connecting with her new daughter and Zuko's half-sister, Ki, who views her mother as a stranger due to the events of the search. There's also some relationship drama with Zuko and Mei, who at this point are no longer together. One of the most interesting things in this comic, and the thing that takes center stage here, is how Zuko struggles to lead his nation at a time when his citizens are unhappy and distrusting of him. In doing this, Zuko makes many mistakes, and it's presented in a way that serves as a continuation of his arc in The Promise. If you recall, Zuko's main struggle there was to not be like his father, where here he's confident in his own ability to lead and is actively trying to not be like Ozai, but because of that, his actions are seen by many as weak. His refusal to act until having thought everything through is to his detriment here. By the end of this story, Zuko realizes the mistakes that he's made and publicly admits it to his entire nation, which I think shows how consistent these comics are with the show, but also how much Zuko has grown as a leader, due in large part to the events of this comic. As we'll later find out without spoiling any big twists, the New Ozai Society no longer want to dethrone Zuko by the end, but rather manipulate him into becoming more Ozai-like. This comic excels at showing us that, even though the war is over, the effects of it and the ideals that influenced it are still very much present. Just because Ozai has been dethroned doesn't mean everyone is now okay with it. The loyalists still exist. Aside from Zuko's main arc, this comic is much more lore-heavy, and when it comes to other characters, it has interesting moments, but they're just that. Moments. Like, for example, with Ursa's struggle of trying to get her daughter to like her again, there's this really great scene where she asks Iroh for advice, and it's a great scene between two characters that we've never seen interact before, and it has that classic Iroh wisdom. But it only lasts for a few pages before we move on to the next thing. The entire comic is filled with this kind of thing, and it kind of took me out of it. The romance drama also feels very unnecessary, since they're very clearly setting up Zuko and Mei getting back together, so at that point, why even break them up in the first place? Overall, Smoke and Shadow presents a lot of good ideas and expands on things that were hinted at in earlier comics, and it's definitely worth a read, but I'd say it's one of the weaker installments so far. Its problem seems to be that it tries to cram too many different storylines and too many different character arcs into one graphic novel, while the previous ones worked because they only had one or two things going on. If you are a fan of Zuko and our other Fire Nation friends, or you just want to see more about the Fire Nation and its history, this is definitely the comic for you, but otherwise it's a bit cluttered as far as the narrative goes. Going from the Fire Nation to the Water Tribe, the next comic in the series is North and South. This storyline plays off of some lines from The Rift, where Katara meets some old friends from the Southern Water Tribe who reveal that things aren't going too well down there, so Katara and Sokka promise to come back to help. When they first get there, they find that their once small village has grown into a big city, reminiscent of what we would later see in The Legend of Korra. This is the work of the Southern Reconstruction Project, a project by the Northern Water Tribe to help rebuild the South after being devastated by the war. This project is being led by two new characters, Malik and Melina, and the next step in their plan is to begin mining oil from beneath the South Pole, assisted by the Earth and Fire refinery. Sokka, with his southern pride and mind for innovation, is all for this project, while Katara feels as though it's taking away her nation's identity. Katara is not completely alone in this idea, however, as there is also an underground group of rebels who want to free the South from the North's influence. Now, if any of this sounds familiar, that's because it is. This is extremely similar to the ideologies that led to the Civil War in Season 2 of The Legend of Korra. In fact, there are a lot of similarities here. Underground group of southern rebels, festival, dangerous twins, a northern occupation, it's all there. I assume this was all intentional, both to draw parallels to The Legend of Korra, as many of these comics were written to do, but also to recontextualize Season 2. The tensions between the North and South didn't just come out of nowhere, and the events of this comic are just the first offense. That said, I think North and South does a much better job at showing the nuance of the two tribes than Season 2 of Korra did. Here we actually see the nuance in action. We see why the South hates the North, and a lot of that goes to the fact that Katara and the rebels were kind of right. Similarly to the theme of the Rift, North and South raises the question of when is modernization too much? Is it worth it to modernize the tribe if you lose the tribe's identity in the process? What Katara learns, however, is that maybe the Southern Water Tribe that she knew wasn't what the tribe was supposed to be. Katara is largely the main focus of this comic, as she has a lot going on. Her relationship with her dad is a big factor, as well as her relationship with her tribe that we just talked about. Unfortunately, it felt as though Sokka was sidelined as a result. I feel like we should have seen more of him working to better his tribe, but instead he's left as not much more than just a bunch of food jokes.
I'm trying to get it out of my mind and into my mouth. I'm starving!
The other characters don't have much of a presence either, other than just being some additional fighters for the big final battle. They bring Aang, Zuko, and the Earth King in later in the comic, but they don't really do much. Their presence here does not really matter. Though I will say, there is a really nice scene where Katara is talking to her dad about love, and Aang shows up just at the end of that conversation. Kinda wholesome, kind of a vibe. Though I have a few gripes, I think North and South is one of the better of the post-series comics. I think its quality largely has to do with how focused it is, opting to focus mainly on Katara and the relationship between the two water tribes. This is kind of the opposite of Smoke and Shadow, which I felt had too much going on. North and South keeps it simple in terms of the plot, but without losing any of the nuance of the situation. Oh, and I guess racial slurs officially exist in the Avatar world. Finally, Toph has something to scream while she's gaming. And the final post-series comic, at least for now, is Imbalance. While the other comic storylines had subtle foreshadowing for the Legend of Korra, this one is extremely on the nose. Imbalance has Team Avatar coming to Cranetown, an industrialized city that was very quickly built where the events of the Rift happened a few stories earlier. In this city, tensions between benders and non-benders begin to reach a boiling point. Benders' supremacy becomes a rather popular ideology among benders, causing them to discriminate and do anything in their power to prevent non-benders from living normal lives. Aang and company need to stop this cell of bender supremacists before they tear the city down from the inside. Now, right off the bat, the first thing I noticed about Imbalance is the art style. I do not like it. I mean, it's charming and all, but I much prefer the look of the other comics. The reason for this is because they brought on a new illustrator for Imbalance, Peter Wortman, and he does some fine work here, and I see what they were going for, but it doesn't really appeal to me. I like the Guru Hero art style much better. But like I said, this comic is extremely obvious with the Korra foreshadowing. We know from season 1 of The Legend of Korra that non-benders felt oppressed by benders, and here we see why they feel that way and why it started. Non-benders felt oppressed because they were, at one point, oppressed by benders, who only oppressed the non-benders because they felt that they were being replaced by non-benders because of the overuse of machines, which again is the whole theme of innovation from the previous installments. There is some very clear social commentary here, and they are not very subtle about it. It definitely recontextualizes the conflict of Korra Season 1, but it feels more like retroactively giving a reason than anything else. Like, Korra came out in 2012, this came out in 2019. A little bit late there, guys. Additionally, it's made incredibly obvious that Cranetown is what will eventually become Republic City, but it feels kind of out of nowhere. I haven't really talked about this thus far, but all the comics up until this point have referenced or been set in the city of Yu Dao, which is established in the promise to be the oldest Fire Nation colony in the Earth Kingdom, and was being set up as a hub for all nations. They were clearly setting up Yu Dao to be Republic City, but here they do a complete 180 and make it some town that didn't even exist until we see it here. Kind of out of the blue. Don't really know why they did that. They also foreshadow some other things here, like the Republic City Council, Air Temple Island, how chi blocking became so prevalent, and the origins of the Republic City Police. However, one interesting thing that they do here that kind of parallels The Legend of Korra, but not quite, is the moral dilemma that Aang has when presented with the option of taking away the bending of the bending supremacist leader. He realizes that it's not an ability that he should be using so liberally, but Toph and some other characters make the very valid point that this person can't be a bender supremacist if they aren't a bender. It's kind of like the opposite of what Amon does, but with a tad more complexity. At the end of the day, Imbalance is fine, I guess. It gave us some insight into what would eventually happen in Korra's time, but also makes some really weird choices that I won't spoil for you, but it's just really weird. I don't really vibe with it. Not too big on this one, but it's definitely worth a read, especially if you're a Korra fan. While there currently aren't any more post-series comics in the same vein as the ones we've been talking about, Avatar comics are still being released in different forms. Instead of aiming to expand the world and bridge the gap like the previous ones, these ones tend to focus on individual characters as little inconsequential side stories. Katara and the Pirate Silver takes place during Season 2 and details Katara getting separated from Team Avatar and her adventure to reunite with them. Toph Beifong's Metalbending Academy is exactly what you expect. It's about Toph teaching people metalbending. I don't really have much to say about these two comics, but they're fine. They're a lot like the Lost Adventures, but just a bit longer, so if you were into those, then you'll probably also like these. You know, they're fun little side stories with little to no larger effect on the greater Avatar world. They seem to be continuing with this trend, as there is an upcoming Suki solo comic about her time at the Boiling Rock, and I hope that they continue to do these, if only to keep the Avatar universe alive, even though I kind of wish they would kind of go back to the more long-form trilogy format. But at the end of the day, I would definitely recommend the Avatar comics to any Avatar fan. While they occasionally will drop the ball with some really obvious story things, the one thing that all of these comics 100% nail is the characters. And that is definitely saying something, because this show is known for its characters, so if the comics are also known for its characters, then you're doing something right. If you're hungry for more of these characters, or are one of those people who think a season 4 was necessary,
It wasn't.
then the comics are definitely for you. It is an extremely tall order to try and continue characters that were essentially already complete, but they do a great job at it, all while introducing new concepts and raising interesting questions that could only have been done in this post-war era of the Avatar world. I didn't spoil anything major in this video because I urge you all to read these comics on your own, form your own opinion, and maybe if enough of you support these comics legally, we can get more trilogies and standalones in the future. But then again, Avatar Studios is a thing now, so perhaps they'll transition any plans that they had for graphic novels to a more animated format. But that is not all for the comics of the Avatar world, as The Legend of Korra also has its own post-series comics, but we'll be taking a look at those next week. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more videos, and consider pledging to my Patreon to help support the channel. I've been MattCMG, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.